Hi, I'm Matthew, and I will start this presentation with a general analysis of Almassi's main points and do my best to break it down into four major parts. In point one, I will talk about epistemic dependency. In point two, I will talk about the education of conflicting claims. In point three, I will discuss trust in numbers. In point four, I will discuss effective trustworthiness. Before we discuss anything, it is important to understand what Almassi means by the epistemic relationship between scientists and the public. The epistemic relationship that Almassi is referring to is how scientists share knowledge through trust and engagement with the public. This relationship exists for many reasons. Amalsi uses notes from John Hardwood to state how he believes many things that he does not have empirical evidence of, and while he could go out and try to procure all the empirical evidence required to make up his belief system, he does not. This is not due to laziness or lack of want, but due to sheer impossibility. The world is too vast and large to be comprehended by one man, as one man is limited by his own morality and mind. Therefore, it makes rational sense to have this epistemic relationship. However, regarding climate change, there is much distrust and conflict over the matter. Even though people rely on scientists to understand the world, many people believe it is rational to distrust them on this matter. It is irrational to not trust the experts on climate change, yet there is no consensus. Amalfi then goes into greater detail over why this distrust exists today. The first reason that Amalfi says this distrust exists in the epistemic relationship between scientists and the public is due to conflicting claims. Conflicting claims create confusion and skepticism among non experts who rely on experts for in depth knowledge. Due to the complex scientific nature of something like anthropogenic climate change, the public has limited ways to verify these claims. So multiple disproving claims act as a deterrent from the matter altogether and works to create radicals, a society made up of individuals who have little care for a problem and individuals who care too much creates conflict which only exasperates the effects of these conflicting claims. These conflicting claims are seen by non-experts more as incompetence or dishonesty rather than as a scientific debate. Therefore, these conflicting claims undermine the epistemic trust required to create urgency and action of the public to work towards solutions of such a crisis. Conflicting claims are also used by political groups and media to further worsen trust. The media and these interest groups thrive off of conflict, and by having these multiple claims, it gives these groups a means to create some, which further fuels the breakdown of the epistemic relationship between scientists and the public. Amalfi then discusses how trust in the use of numbers affects the epistemic relationship between scientists and the public. Amalfi begins by explaining how differing scientific claims all use numerical data like statistics and model-based predictions to try to best communicate the seriousness and urgency of climate change. And while these numbers are an imperative pivotal point for conveying credibility to each scientific conclusion, they work to distance the non expert crowd who are going to find such numbers too confusing or too complex. Such over reliance on numbers without proper explanations diminishes the epistemic relationship. Complex analysis and comparison of global temperatures and global carbon emissions are followed by non involvement or mistrust by the public. This is entirely detrimental to a field such as climate science because for action to be made, public opinion must be swayed. Through overcomplication rather than simplification, ordinary people view scientists as more disconnected from the everyday, thus weakening the epistemic relationship. Scientists need to change the way they present numerical data to make it more easily accessible and understandable to the public. If data is not made with comparison to daily life, then scientists will not be able to garner the trust required to have an epistemic relationship. Instead of simply stating specific numerical increases, scientists should explain how these numerical increases will affect daily living. For example, let's say a study predicts that in the next 10 years the global climate will increase by 2 degrees Celsius. Instead of simply stating the numerical evidence, state the information as such. A 2 degrees Celsius increase in global temperature will be extremely detrimental to all life on the planet. Relate the numerical evidence to tangible examples that the public can grasp, such as how a change would result in an increased extreme weather events, a rise in the cost of living due to a necessity to produce more power to keep houses cool and food from spoiling during transportation. If scientists conducted their research this way, the public would have a greater understanding and concern over the situation at hand, as the information is easily relatable to everyday life. This would strengthen the epistemic relationship and push the public to act on the matter. The last point I will discuss is Almassi's analysis of the critical role that effective trustworthiness has in maintaining a strong epistemic relationship between scientists and the public. Effective trustworthiness is not a scientist's ability to display expertise on a matter or intellectual credibility. It is a scientist's ability to foster an emotional connection and have a proper demonstration of concern for societal well being. Almassi emphasizes how the public must rely on scientists to provide accurate information on complex issues and how public trust is reliant upon how scientists present themselves. If a scientist is perceived as impersonal, cold, and indifferent to public concerns, then the credibility of the scientist rapidly diminishes as this self presentation alienates them from the public. In comparison, a scientist who is easily seen as warm and empathetic becomes more easily liked by the public, in turn increasing trust. This trust, required of an epistemic relationship, is not solely built upon the foundations of science, but rather the very human concept of emotions. Through the proper addressing of emotions in scientific to public communication, a stronger epistemic bond can be formed. Almassi also highlights the importance of an effective trustworthiness in battling against the moral rot of misinformation for self-interest, profit, and political agendas. Scientists who fail to make use of emotions and relatability will not succeed in persuading public opinion. The moral rot of social media and news sources make use of such emotions to persuade their audience to support their misguided agendas. The past and current systematic failures of the scientific community to uphold values of honesty and transparency has led to this very systematic rot. The only way to combat this is through effective trustworthiness. Almassi advocates for a renewed commitment and ethical accountability within the scientific community. Through fostering a scientific culture centered around transparency and honesty, in which scientists openly claim points of potential bias, the public can further engage with the scientific community in good faith. By doing so, the epistemic relationship can be strengthened and restored so that scientists can act as a proper guide in addressing global challenges such as climate change. To reiterate, the four major parts of Almassi's work is the epistemic dependency, the adjudication of conflicting claims, trust in numbers, and effective trustworthiness. We will now move on to the second point in this presentation. Hi, I'm Matthew, and I will start this presentation with a general analysis of Almassi's main points by doing my best to break it down into four major parts. We will now discuss a flaw that both my partner and I saw while doing the first reading of this work, and a flaw that we believe people might also see in Almassi's work, and show how this flaw is not relevant to the work itself. The flaw that we are talking about here is the idea of how education might affect the relationship and trust between scientists and the public regarding climate change. Throughout Almassi's work, the topic of education is not talked about and might seem to be a flaw in some capacity. However, this is done by intention. Education seems to have little to no effect on how a population perceives climate change, but rather the environment a population is surrounded by seems to be the largest determiner. Through Riel's study of the international public opinion on climate change, we witness an interesting dynamic between a country's education level and a country's belief in climate change. While most people would believe that a country who has a higher level of education would have a higher population of people who believe in climate change as a danger or problem as presented as such by scientists, education is not a consistent measure to determine how likely a population would believe in climate change as a problem. While education does act as a solid column in a person's belief and trust system, it is not the only one. Just as a person learns from others, whether that be through interactions or direct education, a person also learns from their environment. A person's environment makes up a substantial portion of how the belief and trust system works. If a person is taught that all lions are beasts, aggressive in nature, yet experiences a phenomenon in which this animal displays kindness and curiosity, that person will look at the phenomenon as something that disproves the once taught theory and make efforts to find out why this theory might have been wrong. This is how basic human curiosity has led to the development of science and scientific theory throughout the ages. So it stands to reason that a person's environment, the place in which they have the most interaction, is the largest component in a person's belief and trust system. However, without straying too much off topic, I will now discuss Yale's study in deeper complexity to display why education is not an apparent factor in the epistemic relationship between scientists and the public. This data map from Yale's study shows how most of the world believes that climate change is happening. Interestingly, we see countries like Angola and Peru having a higher percentage of people who believe in climate change. This is important to notice due to the fact that these two countries do not have a great education system comparatively to countries like United States, Germany, or Spain. This shows how education is most certainly not a determining factor behind the epistemic relationship between scientists and the public. However, the distrust still exists. As these three maps show, it's not distrust in whether climate change is real, but in the distinction the scientists are making. These distinctions are whether climate change is a global crisis or if humans have impacted it. It's interesting to note this graph shown earlier specifically. The countries that have seen the most radical climate and environmental shifts over the last few decades are the countries most likely to admit that people are the cause of this. These countries include Australia, with its countless bushfires over the last decade, which has destroyed thousands of acres of land, and Brazil, which has seen the Amazon rainforest dwindle over time due to human involvement with it. It is, however, important to note that the map shows that the countries admitting to anthropogenic climate change are second world countries and above. Comparatively, third world countries are some of the least likely to admit to it. These third world countries who see these major environmental shifts are less inclined to admit to human involvement because these environmental shifts have led to some level of economic prosperity for these countries. African and other third world countries have exploited their resources and environment since the 19th and 20th century, according to the Chatham House. The burning of fossil fuels and biofuels done in such countries has been proven to be environmentally detrimental. To admit to it would mean to stop or decrease the proficiency of their economy for their environment. These countries already have struggling populations, so the worry over their own people's well being is, of course, going to outweigh the worry of the environment to these people. The graph notes how a couple first world countries do not have a majority population who believe that climate change has anthropogenic factors. What could be the reason for some first world countries to disagree with scientists on how humans have been a major contributor to climate change? The only thing that could come to my mind is for the same reason that third world countries, who are in fact major contributors to climate change, do not admit to it. The reason is money. While scientists perform their moral duty to inform the public of how their actions have impacted their environment, it is not being received. It is because most people do not feel as though they themselves have a major impact on the state of their environment and the global atmosphere. Humans have always acted based on feelings and morals. War is not the product of rational thought, but rather a clash of morality and a battle of emotions on an astronomical scale. The clash between the value of the environment and the value of money seems to be the very reason for this distrust between scientists and the public. Yale's study shows how the epistemic relationship between scientists and people in regards to climate change is not affected by education as we once thought. It is the difference in morals and beliefs that leads to this distrust between scientists and the public. This map from Yale shows the only thing that education does do is change the percentage of people who know more about climate change in scientific means.
Hi, I'm Oliver, and I will be talking about problems that are addressed that we believe could actually be better used to support the argument. Words, they are a powerful tool that influences thinking and understanding. Science direct states that they can numb people, lead them to be passive, or can encourage them to take responsibility and appropriate actions. They are a way in which we talk about climate change can have the way in which we talk about climate change can have an impact on how people understand it, especially its urgency, relevance, and impact. Also, they can impact what a person does with them. People might tend to tune tune out or ignore information if it sounds too scientific for their understanding, or use a specific term such as crisis can provoke action against something. Using accurate word choice can heighten our understanding and effectiveness relating to scientific documents. In Ben Almassi's Climate Change, Epistemic Trust, and Expert Trustworthiness, he expresses the term epistemic, which relates to the degree something is valid. In this, he discusses the epistemological and ethical relationship regarding climate change. This is especially with how society will interpret an expert's findings and knowledge and how they can interpret and make a rational decision on how to proceed. Almassi says that epistemic trust is relying on an expert or someone credible in a field of knowledge on a topic that someone cannot completely comprehend. He claims that the majority of the public who try to understand climate science experience epistemic trust in climate scientists or others who are able to interpret the information. Word choice plays a major role in this. Many scientific articles and studies are not generally easy to understand if a person is not familiar with scientific language. In a study in the journal article Frontiers, they found that the mean readability of traditional scientific writing is 44.4%. Not even half of the participants could read what they were presented with. However, when the readers were presented with something that was in a less scientific language, the mean readability was 66.3%. There was a similar outcome when it came to understanding. The mean underst- for understanding was 47.9% for traditional style of scientific work, whereas with a more accessible style of writing, the average was 57.9%. Again, just under half the participants could understand and comprehend what they were just reading. In addition to readability and understanding, confidence was also tested. With the traditional style of writing, confidence ratings averaged at 41.1%. The mean for the more accessible style was 58.3%. For each test, the averages only decreased as the pieces of text got more difficult. Ben Almassi's word choice in his text affects readers' understanding and engagement with his arguments about epistemic trust. He uses some vocabulary that the public either do not understand the definition at all, or they will misinterpret the meaning of the word, maybe just focusing on part of the word as opposed to the whole. An example of this is consistently using the term epistemic trust. In this case, many people might think that this is purely just trust and have a disregard for the philosophical context of the word. They will think it relates to the trust in their person or personal character as opposed to the actual definition of trust in knowledge, claims, or reasoning from experts. This limits the understanding of his argument. If if he were to use a more understood term that is in more common or simple language, such as trust and expert knowledge, his audience might get a better understanding of this work. I will now be talking about the broad topic, such as climate change. Climate change is a very broad topic. This term can be related to a wide range of fields and areas of concentration. Some of these areas can consist of scientific, social, economic, and political. The United Nations describes climate change as long term shifts in temperatures and weather patterns. These changes could be natural, such as from the sun's activity, or they could be from the impact of humans. such as the burning of fossil fuels. Burning of these fossil fuels, particularly coal, oil, and gas, increases the heat trapping greenhouse gas levels in the Earth's atmosphere, which in effect raises the Earth's overall temperature. So, what is the difference between climate change and global warming? While many people use these two interchangeably, there is actually a difference. According to USGS, the phrase global warming refers only to the rising temperature on Earth, mostly from burning fossil fuels and the increased greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Climate change is more of a topic or category. Global warming falls under the umbrella of climate change. Climate change is the increasing changes in the climate, including but not limited to temperature, precipitation, and wind patterns. However, as climate change is so broad, it can weaken Ben Almassi's arguments. One way it weakens the text is that it is difficult to narrow the focus. Each individual each individual aspect of climate change is not able to be fully addressed, which leads to a sacrifice for either depth or overall coverage. Almassi is trying to address epistemic trust on each individual section of climate change. In doing this, he ended up forfeiting depth and only provided superficial examples and evidence for each. An example of this is how people have a difference in trust between climate scientists and policymakers. Another disadvantage of this is that he was not able to give enough attention to certain parts that might be critical to his argument, perhaps like how to navigate ethical problems on policy. The wide range does not allow for complete elaboration or expansion. Instead of trying to mention everything on climate change, narrowing the focus to one specific topic would be more beneficial. It would allow for a deeper elaboration on how to build trust with the public on that scientific part. Another way that the broad topic of climate change is a weak point is that climate change consists of many epistemic communities. These all have different roles that play a part. Climate scientists provide data on global warming, temperature, and emissions and their impact. Economists economists weigh the pros and cons of involvement. Policymakers make laws and instructions based on interpretations of scientists and their knowledge. Activists discover public opinion and make it heard. Each one of these groups have a different way of going about things, different methods, expertise, and levels of public trust. NSF states that the public tends to trust scientific institutions and climate scientists, but not as much for policymakers. The trust of one group does not extend to another group. These groups can occasionally present conflicting approaches or findings that can confuse the public. Additionally, the way to build trust can differ, such as between scientists and policymakers. Also, the trust in groups differs due to the impact they could have on people. If, say for example, a scientist makes a false conclusion and the policymaker uses this incorrect conclusion to make a law, the public will lose trust in both. Whereas if the policymaker does not implement a law that helps the public, they will lose trust in the policymaker, but not the scientist. Almassi oversimplifies the different branches of epistemic trust on the different aspects of climate change, study, and interpretation. Instead, if Almassi narrowed his topic so it was not so broad, he would be able to explore more depth how the epistemic communities interact and how the trust is formed and also maintained. Instead of using the term climate change, Ben Almassi should strengthen his argument by focusing more on the specifics. An example of something that he could focus on is primarily trust in the climate science. Putting an emphasis on trust in climate science would allow him to elaborate more on the epistemic trust relating to methods, discoveries, and communication about climate science to the public. If he were to focus more on how scientific data is communicated or made certain or uncertain, and how trustworthy experts are perceived, would be more beneficial and provide possible recommendations for addressing misinformation and uncertainty among the public.